They say that history is written by the victors. But in the Antarctic, history is written by the ice. We all know the legend of Sir Ernest Shackleton. We know the miracle of the Endurance expedition, the story of 28 men who plunged into the white abyss and returned, against all odds, without losing a single human life. It is the perfect story of heroism. It is the statue we polish and admire. But statues are cold, and they are silent. They do not tell you what it feels like to starve. They do not tell you what it costs to keep a man alive when the temperature drops to 60 below and the food runs out. The official records speak of navigation and courage, but the private diaries tell a different story. They tell of the day the laughter died. They tell of the day the dogs, the loyal companions who pulled them through hell, ceased to be friends and became fuel. We have sanitized this story for 100 years. We have turned a desperate, bloody struggle for survival into a gentleman's adventure. But tonight we are going to scrape away the myth. We are going to look at the terrible arithmetic of leadership, where morality is a luxury you cannot afford. So settle in, turn off the distractions of the modern world. Join me as we sail back into the freezing dark of 1914 to find the forgotten truth behind the miracle and to ask the question, when the world ends, what are you willing to sacrifice to see the sun rise again? There is a sound on the ice that is unlike any other. It is not the crack of the glacier, nor the howl of the wind that flays the skin from the face. It is not the groaning of timber under the pressure of 1 billion tons of frozen water. It is a smaller sound, a more intimate sound. It is the silence that follows a gunshot. And in that silence there is a heavy, crushing realization that the thing you have just destroyed was the very thing that kept you warm, the thing that pulled you, the thing that loved you when the world had turned into a white, indifferent hell. We look back at history, and we see the statues. We see the bronze busts of men in heavy coats, their eyes fixed on a horizon that ordinary men cannot see. We call them heroes. We call them explorers. We speak of Sir Ernest Shackleton and the miracle of the Endurance expedition. We tell our children the story of 28 men who went into the ice and 28 men who came home. It is the perfect story. It is a story of triumph against the impossible, but history, when it is carved into stone, tends to smooth over the rough edges. It forgets the hunger, it forgets the madness, and most of all, it forgets the price, because while 28 men returned from the white darkness, nothing else did. To save the men, the myth had to feed on something else. This is not just a story about ice and navigation. This is a story about the terrible arithmetic of survival. It is about the moment when a man looks at a creature he has named, a creature he has slept beside, and realizes that the creature is no longer a companion. It is fuel. To understand the end, we must go back to the beginning. We must go back to a time before the ice, before the hunger, to a world of mahogany tables, crystal decanters, and the thick cigar smoke air of London society. The year is 1914. The world stands on a precipice. The Great War is gathering on the horizon like a thunderstorm, but in the drawing rooms of the Royal Geographical Society, the talk is not of artillery or trenches, it is of blank spaces. For a generation, the bottom of the world had been the ultimate prize. The South Pole was the Holy Grail, the last great dragon to be slain by the knights of the British Empire. But that dream had been shattered. Herr Norwegian named Roald Amundsen, a man of cold efficiency and skis, had gone there first. He had planted his flag, taken his picture, and returned, leaving the British to mourn not just a loss of territory, but a loss of national soul. Enter Ernest Shackleton. He was a man built for the age of romance, trapped in an age of industry. He was not a scientist. He was not a distinct military strategist. He was a merchant of dreams. He was charismatic, deeply in debt, and haunted by a fear that terrified him more than death itself, the fear of being ordinary. He had been to the ice before. He had walked within 97 miles of the pole and turned back to save his men from starvation. He knew the taste of failure. He knew the bitter metallic tang of it in the back of the throat. And now, with the pole conquered by another, Shackleton had to invent a new impossible. He took a map of the Antarctic continent, a map that was mostly white paper, and he drew a line across it. Coast to coast, 1,800 miles. It was a staggering ambition. It was not just about touching a specific point. It was about traversing the entire frozen skull of the world. He called it the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The name itself sounded like thunder, but thunder requires money. And so, the explorer became the salesman. Picture him in those London offices leaning forward, his voice a low hypnotic rumble. He wasn't selling geography, he was selling immortality. He told wealthy patrons that this was the last great journey left to humanity. He told them that their names would be written on mountains that no eye had ever seen. He charmed, he borrowed, he leveraged his reputation against a future he could not guarantee. He was building a machine made of men and wood, but he knew that men and wood were not enough. The ice was a living thing. It fought back. To cross the continent, he needed engines that could run on blood and meat. He needed dogs. In the lore of polar exploration, the dog is not a pet. The dog is a tool. Amundsen had proven this. The Norwegians understood that a dog was a tractor that you could eat when the fuel ran out. It was a cold, pragmatic calculus. The British, however, struggled with this. They gave their dogs names from poetry. They projected human souls into their eyes. Shackleton walked this line. He knew he needed the animals. He authorized the purchase of 99 dogs from Canada. They were big, heavy-coated beasts. Part wolf, part collie, part mastiff. Mongrels of the highest order, bred for pulling, bred for biting, bred for surviving in temperatures that would freeze mercury. They arrived like a chaotic army. They were not the sleek uniform huskies of modern racing. These were rough creatures. They fought, they howled, they established hierarchies in blood. And when they looked at the men, they did not see masters. They saw pack members. The men, in turn, began the dangerous process of falling in love. They didn't see the expendable assets listed on the expedition manifest. They saw personalities. They saw Shakespeare, the heavy leader. They saw Samson, the brute. They saw wild spirits that needed to be tamed but not broken. While the dogs were being corralled, Shackleton was securing the vessel. He found a ship in Norway, a ship designed to hunt bears in the Arctic. It was a masterpiece of defensive architecture. The hull was not just wood, it was a fortress. Planks of oak and Norwegian fir sheathed in greenheart, a wood so dense it sinks in water. The bow was 3 distinct layers of solid timber, 4 feet thick. It was designed to meet the ice not as a knife meets butter, but as a hammer meets a wall. He named her the Endurance. It was taken from his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." A noble sentiment, a promise, but looking back it feels less like a name and more like a premonition, a warning of what was required. The provisioning of the Endurance was a feat of logistical madness. We must understand the sheer weight of it. Thousands of pounds of coal, tons of flour, sugar and tea, cases of whiskey to keep the morale high, scientific instruments of brass and glass. And for the dogs? Tons of specialized food, pemmican, a dense brick of dried meat and fat. The ship was loaded until she sat low and heavy in the water. She was a pregnant beast, stuffed with the hopes of an empire. But there was a flaw in the plan. A flaw invisible to the cheering crowds on the dock, but visible to the ice. The ship was designed to withstand pressure, yes, but she was also heavy, she was slow, and she was sailing into a year where the seasons themselves were out of joint. August 1914. The world breaks. War is declared in Europe. The order comes down. The machinery of civilization begins to grind up its young men. Shackleton, standing on the deck of his loaded ship, offers the Endurance and her crew to the British Admiralty for the war effort. It is a gesture of duty, but secretly his heart must have stopped. To come this close, only to be sent to patrol the North Sea. The Admiralty sends a one-word telegram back, "Proceed," and so they slipped away. The Endurance moved down the Thames, past the factories and the smoke, past the grey warships gathering for slaughter, and turned her nose south. As England faded into the mist, the 28 men aboard felt the distinct sensation of a door closing. They were leaving the known world. They were leaving a world where death came from artillery shells and mustard gas, and sailing toward a world where death came from the simple absence of heat. The journey south was a stripping away of layers. The first layer to go was the noise of society, then the warmth of the tropics, then the colors. As they crossed the equator and pushed into the southern hemisphere, The ocean grew darker. The albatrosses appeared, gliding on wings that never seemed to move, watching the ship with ancient, indifferent eyes. Life on board settled into a rhythm. The men and the dogs began to merge into a single tribe. The dogs were housed in kennels on the deck, a rowdy, stinking, vibrant village of fur. The carpenters built them little houses. The sailors spent their off hours sitting with them, learning their barks, learning where they liked to be scratched. They gave them names that reflected their own lives: soldier, sailor, grip, snapper. Shackleton watched this. He was a leader who led from the inside. He didn't lock himself in his cabin. He walked the decks. He smoked cigarettes with the stokers. He played with the dogs. He knew that morale was a battery that had to be charged before the darkness drained it. But he also looked at the dogs and saw the math. Each dog was a mouth. Each mouth required calories. And on the ice, a calorie is a unit of time. They reached the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia in November. This was the last outpost of humanity, a whaling station, a place of blood and oil where Norwegian whalers stripped the blubber from leviathans and boiled it down for profit. The smell of the place was atrocious, a mix of coal smoke and rotting meat. But to the men of the Endurance, it was a paradise. It was the last pub, the last post office, the last bed that didn't rock. The whalers, men who knew the Southern Ocean better than anyone, looked at Shackleton's maps and shook their heads. They told him the ice was bad this year. They said the pack had moved north earlier than usual. The Weddell Sea, the body of water Shackleton intended to cross, was known as the most treacherous stretch of water on the planet. It was a factory of ice. It churned it out, rotating it in a massive clockwise gyre, grinding ships to splinters. "Wait," the whalers said. "Wait for next year." But Shackleton couldn't wait. He had debts. He had a reputation. He had the momentum of a man falling forward. He believed in his luck. He believed in the Endurance. He gave the order to coal the ship to the brim. They piled coal on the decks until the ship looked less like an exploration vessel and more like a barge. Every inch of space was fuel. On December 5, 1914, the Endurance cast off from South Georgia. The whalers stood on the docks, silent. They watched the ship steam out of the harbor and into the open ocean. They knew what lay ahead. For the first few days, the ocean was open. The ship rolled in the heavy swells of the south. But then the horizon began to change. It wasn't a line anymore. It was a glow, a strange white luminescence that reflected the sky. This was the ice blink, the reflection of the pack ice on the clouds. It was the signal that the gate was approaching. The first ice they met was beautiful. Loose floes, sculpted by the wind into fantastical shapes. Swans, castles, cathedrals of white and blue. The men leaned over the rails, mesmerized. The dogs barked at seals that lazed on the passing rafts. It felt like a voyage through a fairy tale. The sun didn't set. It just dipped and rose, bathing the world in a perpetual golden twilight. But as they pushed deeper, the beauty began to harden. The floes became larger. They became closer together. The lanes of dark water between them narrowed. The Endurance was no longer sailing. She was ramming. The captain, Frank Worsley, would spot a lead, a crack in the ice, and signal the engine room. The ship would surge forward, her massive bow rising up onto the ice, using her weight to crack it, smashing through with a sound like cannon fire. Then they would stop, reverse, ram again. It was slow, violent work. The ship shuddered constantly. The dogs howled in confusion. Below decks, the timbers groaned. Shackleton stood on the bridge, watching the white world tighten around them. He was looking for land. He was looking for Varsel Bay, the drop-off point for his transcontinental march. He was close. Tantalizingly close. But the Weddell Sea has a malicious intelligence. The wind shifted. It stopped blowing from the south, which would have pushed the ice away, and began to blow from the north. It packed the ice against the continent. It closed the door. The temperature dropped. The water between the floes began to freeze into a gluey sludge. The Endurance was a strong ship, but she was fighting a continent. On January 18, 1915, the gale died down. A strange silence fell over the Weddell Sea. The water smoothed out. The ice floes, which had been grinding against each other, stopped moving. They settled. They locked together. The Endurance was steaming through a narrow lead, a vein of black water in a body of white, and then the vein collapsed. The ice closed in from both sides. Softly at first, a gentle squeeze. The ship stopped. The engines churned, the propeller thrashed the water, but she didn't move. The men came up on deck. They looked over the side. The ice was tight against the hull. There was no water visible, just white, stretching to the horizon in every direction. They waited. They thought the tide would turn. They thought the wind would shift. They played football on the ice to pass the time. The dogs were brought out to run, delighting in the solid ground. It felt like an intermission, a pause in the drama. But the sun was beginning to dip lower. The 24-hour daylight was fading. The shadows were getting longer. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The sludge between the floes hardened into concrete. Shackleton walked the ice around the ship. He tested it with his heel. He looked at the sky. He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but he knew. The race was over. The expedition to cross the continent had ended before a single boot touched the mainland. The Endurance was no longer a ship, she was a winter station. She was a tiny speck of wood and warmth, trapped in 1,000,000 square miles of freezing hostility. And aboard that speck were 69 dogs and 28 men, with a finite amount of food, and a winter approaching that would last for months. The trap had snapped shut, and inside the trap the hunger began to wake up. The transition from explorer to prisoner is not sudden. It does not happen with the clang of a cell door or the turning of a key. In the Antarctic, it happens in silence. It happens when the horizon stops changing. For the men of the Endurance, the reality settled in with the slow, grinding certainty of the ice itself. February turned to March. The sun, which had been a constant companion, began to circle lower and lower, a pale coin rolling along the edge of the world. The temperature dropped until the mercury huddled at the bottom of the glass, and the ship, the magnificent oak-ribbed fortress built to conquer the pole, simply ceased to be a ship. It became a building, a wooden house rooted in a garden of white stone. Shackleton watched the ice. He didn't just look at it. He studied it with the obsession of a man reading his own death warrant. He saw what the others tried to ignore. The ice wasn't solid land. It was a restless, shifting skin over a black ocean. It was drifting. The entire pack, millions of tons of it, was rotating slowly, dragging the ship with it. They were moving, yes, but they were moving to the whims of the current, drifting hundreds of miles to the north, then the west in a dizzying, jagged line that led nowhere. The order was given to winter in. It was a phrase that sounded cozy, like settling into a cottage for the season. In practice, it was the militarization of survival. The engines were powered down, the fires were banked. The Endurance was modified from a vessel of transport into a vessel of waiting. The interior of the ship was reorganized. The officers and the scientists, usually separated by the hierarchy of the sea, moved into the forward hold to conserve heat. They called their new quarters the Ritz. It was a dark, cramped space, smelling of tobacco, wet wool, and unwashed men. But it was warm, or at least warmer than the outside. Outside, the world was undergoing a terrifying transformation. As the Antarctic winter approached, the light began to fail. It wasn't just that the days got shorter, the quality of the light died. The gold and blue of summer faded into a bruised purple, then a grey twilight, and finally, the long, impenetrable black of the polar night. Imagine living in a world without colour. Imagine a darkness so complete that the only illumination comes from the stars and the pale, ghostly reflection of the snow. In that darkness, the cold became a physical antagonist. It was an entity. It sought out gaps in the clothing. It turned breath into ice crystals that clung to beards and eyebrows, masking every man in a uniform of frost. Inside the ship, condensation froze on the walls. Men would wake up to find their blankets stiff, frozen to the hull by the moisture of their own sleeping breath. Shackleton knew that the cold could kill a man's body, but the darkness would kill his mind. Boredom was the enemy now. Despair was the shark swimming in the water, so he became the ringmaster of a desperate circus. He ordered mandatory haircuts. He organized football matches on the ice in the twilight, the men slipping and sliding, their breath pluming like steam engines. He organized theatrical evenings, where burly sailors dressed in makeshift costumes and sang songs from the London music halls. They laughed. They laughed loudly. They laughed because the captain insisted on it. But beneath the laughter, there was a tension that vibrated like a plucked wire. You could see it in the way they checked the food stores. You could see it in the way they looked at the dogs. The dogs were the barometer of the expedition. In the beginning, they were merely restless. They were creatures of motion, bred to pull, to run, to work. Now they were chained to the ice, arranged in dog towns around the ship. Great igloos were built for them, little domes of ice to shield them from the wind. They became neighbors. The bond between the men and the dogs deepened in the darkness. When a man is stripped of his family, his country, and his purpose, he will pour his affection into anything that offers warmth. The sailors spent hours in the dog lines. They groomed the thick, matted fur. They broke up fights. They spoke to the animals in the soft, cooing voices usually reserved for children. They projected personalities onto them. There was Shakespeare, the brooding intellectual of the pack. Hackenschmidt, the muscle-bound bully. Slipper, the eager pleaser. The dogs were not just assets. They were characters in the daily soap opera of the ice. They offered something the men desperately needed. Uncritical devotion. A dog doesn't care if the expedition has failed. A dog doesn't care about the debts back in London. A dog only cares that you are there and that you have food. But food was becoming the silent, screaming question in every officer's mind. Deep in the belly of the ship, the storekeeper marked his ledgers. He counted the crates of flour. He counted the tins of meat. He weighed the pemmican. The math was simple and it was brutal. They had provisions for a crossing, yes, but they did not have provisions for a siege. The dogs were hungry. These were large animals, 90 pounds of muscle and furnace-like metabolism, designed to burn thousands of calories a day in the extreme cold. They required meat, massive amounts of it. The expedition had brought tons of dog pemmican, but the supply was finite. As the winter deepened, the local wildlife vanished. The seals and penguins, which had been plentiful in the summer, migrated north to escape the crushing dark. The fresh meat stopped coming in. The dogs began to look at the men with a new intensity. It wasn't aggression, exactly. It was an interrogation. Where is the food? The handlers began to sneak scraps. A biscuit here, a piece of seal blubber there. They stole from their own future to quiet the pleading eyes of their charges. Shackleton knew it. He saw the way the men grew thinner while the dogs remained stout. He said nothing, not yet, but in the privacy of his cabin, by the light of a flickering oil lamp, he was doing a different kind of math. He was calculating the weight of a life. If the ship remained stuck, if they had to stay another winter, or if the ship broke and they had to march, what was the value of a dog? Was a dog an engine of rescue, or was it a consumer of resources? The answer lay in the ice. In June, the middle of the Antarctic winter, the ice began to change. For months it had been relatively static, a solid sheet. But the pressure of the ocean currents, millions of miles of water pushing against the continent, began to buckle the pack. It started with a sound, a low, distant rumble, like a train passing in the night. Then it grew closer. It became a roar. The ice was under compression. Massive floes, miles wide and feet thick, were being driven against each other. They didn't just bump, they shattered. Giant blocks of ice weighing hundreds of tons were thrust into the air, creating jagged mountain ranges of pressure ridges. The Endurance was no longer in a safe harbor. She was in the jaws of a vice. The men would lie in their bunks at night and listen to the ice attacking the ship. It sounded like a giant hand squeezing a wicker basket. The heavy oak beams of the hull would groan. Nails would pop from the woodwork with the sound of pistol shots. The ship would shudder, vibrating so violently that lamps would swing from the ceiling. Shackleton walked the decks, sleepless. He would stand at the rail listening to the cacophony of the pressure. He kept his face calm. He told the men it was just the ice settling. He told them the ship was built for this. "She's a sturdy old girl," he would say, patting the rail. "She'll spring back." But he knew the truth. No thing built by human hands can withstand the focused pressure of the polar cap. The Endurance was strong, but she was finite. The ice was infinite. The dogs sensed the danger before the men did. Animals have a frequency for disaster. In the dog towns on the ice, the howling began. It wasn't the excited yipping of feeding time. It was a mournful, collective wailing that drifted through the darkness and seeped into the men's dreams. The dogs tugged at their chains. They paced their circles. They knew the ground beneath them was becoming a battlefield. By July, the pressure waves were hitting the ship almost daily. The ice would grab the hull and lift it. The entire ship, hundreds of tons of wood and iron, would be heaved upward, listing at crazy angles. The men had to walk on the walls of their cabins. Soup bowls slid off tables. The dogs were brought on board for safety, then put back on the ice, then brought back again. It was a dance of anxiety. Shackleton held a private meeting with Frank Wild, his second in command. Wild was a small, tough man, a veteran of the ice. They looked at the charts. They looked at the stores. They spoke in low voices about the eventuality. The eventuality was the destruction of the ship. If the Endurance was crushed, they would be cast out onto the ice. They would be 2,000 miles from civilization, floating on a dissolving raft of frozen water, with no radio, no hope of rescue, and limited supplies. "If we have to march," Shackleton said, his voice flat, "we cannot carry the food for the dogs." Wild nodded. He didn't need to ask what that meant. The equation was balancing itself. If the dogs couldn't pull, they couldn't eat. And if they couldn't eat, but the order was not given, not yet. Hope is a stubborn thing. They hoped for a crack in the ice. They hoped for a gale to blow the pack apart. They waited. October came. The spring sun returned, bringing with it a cruel irony. The light revealed the extent of their entrapment. The ice stretched forever. And with the spring came the breakup. The ice wasn't melting. It was moving more violently. On October 24th, the final assault began. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing execution. The ship was caught between three massive floes. They began to rotate, creating a shearing force. The Endurance was twisted. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of a forest being snapped in half. Huge timber beams, trunks of ancient oaks, snapped like matchsticks. The deck buckled. The planks opened up. Water, black and freezing, began to pour into the hold. The men manned the pumps. They pumped for 3 days and 3 nights. They stood in freezing water up to their waists, working levers until their muscles seized, singing songs to keep the rhythm. Shackleton stood among them, cheering them on, passing out hot milk and whiskey. "She'll hold," he cried. "Work, boys, work." But the ocean does not care about work. The stern of the ship was ripped open. The rudder was torn off. The water rose. On October 27th, the pressure reached its peak. The ship was literally being compressed into a smaller shape. The sides were bowing in. The deck was exploding upwards. Shackleton stood on the bridge. He felt the deck dying beneath his feet. He looked at his men, exhausted, freezing, their eyes rimmed with red. He looked at the dogs, who were terrified, scrambling for footing on the listing deck. He knew that to stay was suicide. The ship was no longer a shelter, it was a trap. "She's going, boys," he said softly. Then he raised his voice, fighting to keep it steady. "Abandon ship. Get everything onto the ice." It was a scene of controlled chaos. The men scrambled to salvage what they could: tents, sleeping bags, the navigational instruments, the banjo, and the food. Every tin, every biscuit, every crate was hauled up from the flooding hold and passed hand to hand over the side, onto the ice floe that was now their only home. And the dogs. The handlers dragged the dogs down the gangways. The animals were frantic. They slipped and slid, their claws scrabbling on the wood. They were thrown onto the ice, chained to safety lines. They barked at the ship, barking at the monster that was groaning and dying before them. That night, the 28 men stood on the ice floe. The temperature was -15 degrees. They pitched their flimsy tents on the frozen skin of the ocean. A few hundred yards away, the Endurance fought her final battle. Her lights were still on, powered by the dying generator. She was listing heavily to port, her bow crushed, her rigging a tangled mess of wire and rope against the stars. The men watched her. They didn't speak. This was their world. This was their warmth. This was their way home. And as they watched, the ice gave one final squeeze. The lights flickered. The masts shuddered. and with a sound like a dying gasp, the stern lifted and the nose plunged down. The ice closed over the deck. The lights went out. Darkness reclaimed the Weddell Sea. Shackleton turned to his men. His face was a mask of calm, but inside, the fire of ambition had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard flame of responsibility. The explorer was dead. The leader was born. He looked at the pile of supplies. It was a pitifully small mound against the vastness of the night. He looked at the dogs, curled in the snow, shivering. "So," Shackleton said, his voice cutting through the wind, "the ship and the stores have gone. So now we'll go home." It was a lie. He had no idea how to get them home. He had no map for this. They were castaways in the most hostile environment on Earth, drifting on a piece of ice that could crack at any moment. And in the silence that followed, the stomach of every man and every dog made the same sound. The hunger was no longer a guest. It was the master. The reality was absolute. The machine was broken. Now the crisis would begin. And the first casualties of that crisis were already breathing clouds of steam into the cold air, waiting for a meal that would not come. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from standing on a frozen ocean, watching the only home you have ever known disappear beneath the ice. When the Endurance finally sank, she didn't go quietly. She went with a sigh, a release of air and timber that sounded like a living thing giving up the ghost. And then, the hole she left in the ice simply healed over. The white slush rushed in, the crystals knit together, and within an hour, it was as if the ship had never existed. 28 men were left standing on a drifting raft of ice, 1,000 miles from the nearest human being. They had no radio, they had no engine. They had a few heaps of salvage supplies, 3 small lifeboats dragged from the wreckage, and the dogs. At that moment, the dogs were the only optimism left. They were tethered in their lines, looking at the men, tails wagging, breath pluming in the cold air. They didn't understand the catastrophe. To a dog, as long as the pack is together, the world is fine. But Shackleton looked at them and saw the tragedy that was coming. He saw it with the clarity of a butcher. They called this new home Dump Camp. It was a chaotic sprawl of tents and crates on a piece of ice less than a mile square. The ice was not land. It was a conveyor belt. Shackleton sat in his tent, shivering in a sleeping bag that was slowly freezing solid and did the navigation math. The currents were dragging them north, yes, but they were also dragging them east, away from the solid earth of the Antarctic Peninsula, out toward the open, violent ocean. He decided they had to march. It was a desperate idea. They would harness the dogs, load the lifeboats onto sledges, and walk across the frozen sea to the land. It was a dream of conquest, a hangover from the days when they thought they were explorers. They set out on October 30th. It was a disaster. The Antarctic ice is not a skating rink. It is a junkyard. It is a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, soft snow, hidden crevasses, and upturned blocks of ice sharp enough to slice through boots. The men harnessed themselves alongside the dogs, straining against ropes, dragging boats that weighed over a ton each. They pulled until their hearts hammered against their ribs. They pulled until they were vomiting from exhaustion. After 3 days of hellish effort, they had moved less than 2 miles. Shackleton stood on a ridge of ice and looked back. He could still see the spot where the ship had gone down. They were burning more calories dragging the supplies than the supplies contained. The ice was defeating them. He raised his hand. "Stop," he said. "Pitch the tents." They called this new location Ocean Camp. It was an admission of defeat. They were not going to walk out of this. They were going to have to drift, passengers on a melting train waiting for the ocean to decide their fate. And it was here, in the stillness of Ocean Camp, that the new reality set in. The supplies were finite. The seals were gone. The penguins were gone. The larder was empty. And the dogs, the beautiful, loyal, hungry dogs, were consuming a pound of meat every day. Shackleton called the photographer, Frank Hurley, and the wild-eyed carpenter, Chippy McNeish, to his tent. He didn't ask for their opinions. He gave orders. He told McNeish that his cat, Mrs. Chippy, a tabby that had become the expedition's mascot, could not survive. She was small. She had no insulation. She would freeze, or the dogs would tear her apart. Then he spoke about the puppies. The dogs had bred during the winter. There were litters of pups, tiny squeaking balls of fur that the men had carried inside their jackets to keep warm. They were the only soft things in a hard world. "They cannot pull," Shackleton said, "and they require milk we do not have." That afternoon the first shots rang out. It wasn't the sound of hunting. It was a flat, dull crack that was swallowed instantly by the vastness of the ice. The carpenter wept. The men turned their faces away. It was the first shedding of innocence. They were no longer preserving life. They were curating it. But the adult dogs were safe, for now. They were the engine. If the ice broke, if they reached land, the dogs would pull the sledges. They were the ticket home. Months passed. The year turned to 1916. The ice floe they were camping on began to erode. It was rotting from underneath. The warmer water of the approaching summer was eating the foundation of their world. They could feel the swell of the ocean beneath their feet now, a slow, rhythmic heaving that made the horizon tilt. It was a nauseating reminder that they were walking on water. Food rations were cut, then cut again. The men were eating barely enough to keep their internal fires burning. They became obsessed with food. They didn't talk about women or money anymore. They talked about dumplings. They talked about roast beef. They described imaginary meals to each other with pornographic detail. And the dogs began to suffer. Their ribs showed through their heavy coats. Their eyes grew dull. They stopped playing. They lay in the snow, conserving energy, waiting for the handlers who came with smaller and smaller portions of seal meat. Shackleton watched the stockpile dwindle. He saw the inevitable intersection of two lines on a graph, the line of food supply falling and the line of time rising. When those lines crossed, everyone died. In January, the order came. It was not a sudden decree. It was a whispered conversation between Shackleton and Wild. The teams were to be broken up. The weaker dogs, the ones who had lost their spirit, the ones who limped, they were liabilities. The logic was unassailable. The morality was unbearable. The men who had to do the deed were the dog drivers. These were the men who had named the dogs, slept with them, shared their warmth. They drew lots. They didn't want to know who was killing whom, but they knew. They took the dogs one by one behind a large hummock of ice, away from the camp, so the others wouldn't see. But the dogs knew. Animals smell death. They smell the cortisol in the sweat of the man holding the leash. One by one, the shots came. In crack and silence. In crack. Silence. The men walked back to the tents, their faces grey, their eyes hollow. They had just killed their friends, but the horror was not finished. The horror was just beginning, because you do not waste protein in the Antarctic. The carcasses were skinned. The meat was butchered. The flesh, dark and stringy, was carried to the blubber stove. Imagine the psychological breaking point. You are a civilized man from Edwardian England. You have been raised with table manners and Sunday school. And now you're sitting on a blood-stained block of ice, holding a tin plate, staring at a stew made from the creature that licked your face yesterday. The first time they ate the dogs, there was silence in the mess tent. Some men could not do it. They wept over their plates. They vomited. But hunger is a patient teacher. Hunger dismantles your ethics piece by piece until only biology remains. Shackleton ate. He forced himself to eat calmly, deliberately. He knew that if he showed hesitation, the men would break. He showed them that this was not cannibalism. It was fuel. It was the Eucharist of survival. They said the meat tasted like beef, but tougher. They said it was oily. But as the days went on, and the cold deepened, the dog meat became something else. It became warmth. It became the energy to lift a boot. It became the strength to pull a rope. The dogs, in their death, were keeping the men alive just as they had in life. They were still pulling the expedition, only now they were doing it from the inside. By April 1916, the unthinkable had become routine. The teams were gone. The dog lines were empty. The noise of the camp, the barking, the growling, the life was gone. There was only the sound of the wind and the voices of 28 men who were slowly turning into skeletons. And then the ice betrayed them completely. They had drifted north, out of the deep freeze and into the open throat of the Southern Ocean. The floe they were camping on, which had once been a mile wide, began to crack. A split would open up under a tent in the middle of the night, waking men with the sound of the ocean splashing inches from their heads. The flow broke into a triangle, then a smaller square. It was disintegrating. On April 9th, Shackleton gave the final order: launch the boats. The 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills Imbigs, were pushed into the ink-black water. They were small, open whalers, 20 feet long, designed for short trips to harbor, not for navigating the worst ocean on Earth. The men piled in. They were sitting on top of each other, knees against chests, wet, freezing, and terrified. They had no water. They had the last scraps of dog meat, and they were rowing into a nightmare. For 7 days they battled the ocean. This was not sailing. It was drowning in slow motion. The waves were 40 feet high, grey walls of water that hid the sky. The temperature was so low that the spray froze on the men's coats, turning them into suits of armor. They had to beat the ice off the sails with clubs to keep the boats from becoming top-heavy and capsizing. They didn't sleep. If you slept, you froze. They huddled together, a mass of shivering humanity sharing body heat. They suffered from thirst that was more agonizing than the hunger. Their tongues swelled in their mouths, their lips cracked and bled. They sucked on raw seal skin to generate saliva. Shackleton stood in the stern of the James Caird, his beard matted with ice, his eyes red rims of exhaustion. He didn't sleep for 90 hours. He steered. He watched the waves. He kept the 3 boats together by sheer force of will. He shouted into the wind, singing songs, cracking jokes, lying to them that land was just over the next crest. And then, through the grey mist, a shape appeared. It wasn't a cloud, it was hard. It was black rock, Elephant Island. It was a bleak, desolate rock jutting out of the ocean, whipped by gale-force winds. It was not a paradise. It was a hellscape of glaciers and jagged cliffs. But to the men in the boats it was heaven. It was solid. It was a place where the ground didn't move. The landing was a chaotic crash. The boat surfed in on the breakers, grinding against the stones. Men jumped into the freezing surf, stumbling, falling, crawling on their hands and knees up the beach. Some of them were laughing hysterically. Some were crying. One man scooped up the pebbles and tried to drink them, his mind broken by thirst. They fell onto the stones, hugging the earth. It was the first time they had touched land in 497 days. But as the adrenaline faded, the reality of Elephant Island revealed itself. It was a prison. It was far outside the shipping lanes. No whalers came here. No explorers came here. It was a blank spot on the map. They had escaped the ice, but they had landed in a tomb. They found a narrow spit of shingle beach, backed by a glacier that dropped hunks of ice the size of houses. The wind was a constant hurricane. There was no shelter. They turned the 2 smaller boats upside down and propped them up on stone walls to create a makeshift hut. They crawled underneath, 28 men packed like sardines in a tin, lying in the mud and guano of penguins. They were alive, but they were trapped. The food was almost gone. The dog meat was finished. They hunted penguins, slaughtering the birds with clubs, stripping the blubber to burn in a smoky, greasy fire. They looked like monsters. Their hair hung to their shoulders. Their faces were black with soot and blubber smoke. Their clothes were rags stiff with grease and blood. Shackleton looked at his men. He saw the apathy setting in. He saw the light going out behind their eyes. They had fought the ice, they had fought the ocean, but they could not fight the waiting. If they stayed on Elephant Island, they would die one by one. Starvation would take them, or the cold, or the madness. There was only one card left to play. It was a suicide mission. A journey so impossible that even to suggest it seemed like the raving of a lunatic. Shackleton called for the carpenter, Chippy McNish. He pointed to the James Caird, the largest of the 3 lifeboats. It was 22 feet long, a splinter, a toy. "We have to go to South Georgia," Shackleton said. South Georgia was 800 miles away. To get there, they would have to cross the Drake Passage, the wildest stretch of ocean on the planet. They would have to sail a 20-foot open boat through waves the size of cathedrals, through hurricane winds, through blizzards in winter. If they missed the island, there was nothing beyond it but 3,000 miles of empty Atlantic. They would be lost forever. McNish looked at the boat. He looked at the ocean. He looked at Shackleton. He didn't argue. He picked up his tools. He began to raise the sides of the boat, scavenging wood from the other boats, stealing nails from the crates. He built a makeshift deck out of canvas and sledge runners. He sealed the seams with lamp wick and seal blood. He was building a coffin, hoping it would float. Shackleton selected 5 men to go with him. Worsley, the navigator, whose eyes would have to find a needle in a haystack of waves. Crean, the giant Irishman, strong as an ox. McNeish, the carpenter. McCarthy and Vincent, 2 sailors who were tough but whose morale was cracking. Shackleton took them because he didn't trust them to survive the weight. On Easter Monday, 1916, they pushed the James Caird into the surf. The 22 men staying behind stood on the beach. They were gaunt, ragged scarecrows. They waved, they didn't cheer. They watched their only hope disappear into the grey mist of the ocean. Shackleton stood at the tiller. He looked back at the island, at the small, dark figures of his crew. He knew the odds. He knew that the math said they were already dead. But he also knew something else. He knew that he had eaten the dogs. He knew the price that had been paid to get them this far. He turned his back on the land and looked into the storm. The final act had begun. The myth was about to be forged in salt water and impossible endurance. The indifferent machine of nature had taken everything from them, their ship, their animals, their dignity. But it had not taken their will. The boat rose on a swell, and the world disappeared. There was only the ocean, and the ocean was hungry. 800 miles. It is a distance that is easy to say. In a modern car, it is a long day's drive. In an airplane, it is an hour and a half. But in the Southern Ocean, in a 22-foot lifeboat named the James Caird, 800 miles is not a distance. It is a gauntlet. It is a vast, heaving, liquid machine designed to destroy anything that floats. When the James Caird slipped away from Elephant Island, she disappeared into a world of violence. The men who watched from the beach saw her vanish into the grey troughs of the waves, and many of them believed they were watching a funeral procession. And in a way they were. The men inside that boat were already dead. They just refused to lie down. The interior of the James Caird was a dark, wet tomb. Shackleton, Worsley, Crean, McNeish, McCarthy and Vincent. 6 men. They crawled over each other in the gloom beneath the makeshift decking. There was no room to sit upright. There was no room to stretch out. They lay in a tangled heap of limbs, soaking wet sleeping bags, and boulders they had loaded for ballast. The sleeping bags were the first to betray them. They were made of reindeer hide, fur side in. They were warm when dry, but when wet, they began to rot. They shed their hair. The men would wake up choking, coughing up clumps of reindeer hair that had been inhaled into their lungs. The smell inside the boat was a thick, cloying mixture of mold, unwashed bodies, salt water, and fear. But the real enemy was outside. The Southern Ocean is the only place on Earth where the wind can circle the globe without hitting land. It builds up momentum for thousands of miles, creating swells that are not like normal waves. They are moving hills. They are grey mountains of water, 50, 60 feet high, rolling with the weight of freight trains. The James Caird was a cork. She would climb the face of a wave, hanging for a terrifying second at the summit, the wind screaming through the rigging, and then plunge down into the trough, the stomach-dropping sensation of a falling elevator. Then the next mountain would roll over them. Frank Worsley, the navigator, performed miracles. Navigation requires a view of the sun or stars. For days, the sky was a leaden sheet of grey, but every now and then, a gap would open. Worsley would cling to the mast, his arms wrapped around the wood to stop from being thrown overboard, and wait. He would catch a glimpse of a star, shout the angle to the men below, and then collapse back into the boat. He was navigating by geometry and instinct, plotting a course to a speck of land in a boundless ocean. If he was off by even 1 degree, they would miss South Georgia and be swept out into the infinite Atlantic to die of thirst. Thirst became the torture. They had water kegs, but one of them had been damaged. Salt water had seeped in. The water was brackish, undrinkable. Their tongues swelled until they filled their mouths. Their throats closed up. They couldn't eat because they couldn't swallow. They dreamed of faucets. They dreamed of waterfalls. On the 7th day, the ocean decided to end it. Shackleton was at the tiller. It was midnight. He saw a line of clearing sky to the south. He called out to the men, "Sky clearing a bit, boys." He thought the storm was breaking. But then he realized It wasn't the sky, it was white foam. It was a rogue wave, a giant among giants. A wall of water stretching from horizon to horizon, so high it blotted out the stars. It hit them with a physical impact that felt like a car crash. The boat was buried. For a frantic eternity, they were underwater. The men held their breath, waiting for the timbers to crack, waiting for the end. Then, shuddering, heavy with water, the James Caird rose. She surfaced like a drowning animal. The men scrambled with pots, with sleeping bags, with their bare hands, bailing the water out. They fought for their lives for 10 minutes, screaming over the wind, until the boat was light enough to ride the next swell. They survived, but they were broken. Vincent and McCarthy were catatonic, lying in the bilge water, no longer caring if they lived or died. McNeish, the carpenter, was defiant, but failing. Only Shackleton, Worsley, and the iron-willed Tom Crean kept moving. For 16 days they endured this, 16 days of being shaken, frozen, and drowned. And then a piece of kelp floated by. Then a bird. Through the mist, the black cliffs of South Georgia appeared. It should have been a moment of triumph, but the ocean has a cruel sense of humor. As they approached the coast, a hurricane struck. It was the worst storm of the entire journey. For 9 hours they were battered against the coast, unable to land, terrified of being smashed against the unseen rocks. They could hear the roar of the breakers. They were minutes from safety, yet they were being clawed back by the sea. Finally, the wind shifted. On May 10th, 1916, the James Caird surfed into King Haakon Bay. They crashed onto a rocky beach. They fell out of the boat, crawling on hands and knees to a small stream of glacial runoff. They plunged their faces into the water and drank. They drank until they vomited, and then they drank again. They had done the impossible. They had sailed the boat, but they had landed on the wrong side of the island. South Georgia is a spine of mountains. The whaling stations, the ships, the radios, the people were on the north coast. Between the men and their rescue lay the interior of the island, a landscape of glaciers, peaks, and snowfields that had never been crossed by a human being. Not once. The boat was wrecked. The rudder was gone. Vincent and McNeish were too weak to walk. They could not sail around the island. They had to go over it. Shackleton looked at the mountains. They were jagged teeth biting into the clouds. He looked at Worsley and Crean. "We have to cross," he said. They took the screws out of the James Caird's hull. They pushed them through the soles of their rotting boots to create makeshift crampons. They took a length of rope and a carpenter's adze to use as an ice axe. They left the weak men under the overturned boat and began to climb. This was the final test. If the boat journey was a trial of endurance, the crossing was a trial of faith. They climbed into the fog. They had no map, they had no tent, they had to keep moving, because if they stopped to sleep in the sub-zero temperatures without shelter, they would never wake up. They climbed a ridge, razor-sharp and steep, only to find a sheer drop on the other side. They had to retrace their steps, down into the valley, up the next peak, down again. It was a maze of ice. Night fell. They were trapped on top of a mountain ridge. The fog was freezing around them. Below them, the slope vanished into shadow. Shackleton knew they were freezing to death. The wind was sucking the last heat from their bodies. "We have to slide," he said. Worsley and Crean looked at him. To slide down an unknown mountain in the dark is suicide. There could be a precipice. There could be rocks. "It's the only way," Shackleton insisted. They sat on their coiled ropes like sleds. They locked their arms around each other. Shackleton, Worsley, Crean, 3 ghosts on a mountaintop. And then they pushed off. They plummeted into the darkness. The wind roared in their ears. The speed built up, 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. They were falling through the black void, waiting for the impact that would kill them. But the impact never came. The slope curved gently. They slowed down. They came to a stop in a bank of soft snow at the bottom of the valley. They stood up, shaking, laughing hysterically. They had dropped 3,000 feet in minutes. They had cheated death again. They walked on. And as they walked, a strange thing happened. All 3 men would later report the same sensation. They felt that there were not 3 of them, but 4. A silent companion walking just behind them. A presence. They never spoke of it to each other until years later, but on that ice, in the thin air of the peaks, They felt they were being shepherded. Morning came. May 20th. They were exhausted. Their faces were black with frostbite and blubber smoke. Their hair was long and matted. Their clothes were rags. They heard a sound. It was faint at first. A whistle. It was the 7:00 a.m. steam whistle at the Stromness whaling station, calling the men to work. It was the sound of the 20th century. It was the sound of schedules, of industry, of hot coffee and warm beds. To Shackleton, it was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. They descended the final waterfall, lowering themselves through the freezing spray. They stumbled toward the station. Imagine the scene. The station manager, a Norwegian, was standing in his office. He was clean-shaven. He was wearing a suit. He looked up to see 3 creatures standing in his doorway. They smelled of death. They looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. The manager stood up. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. The man in the center, the one with the haunted eyes, straightened his back. He tried to summon the voice of the Edwardian gentleman he had once been. "My name is Shackleton," he rasped. "We have lost our ship." The manager wept. They were taken in. They were bathed. They were fed. But Shackleton could not rest. While Worsley and Crean slept the sleep of the dead, Shackleton was already pacing. He was already looking at the sea. He had saved himself. He had saved the 2 men with him. But 22 men were still on Elephant Island. They were living under 2 overturned boats, eating penguins, rotting in the damp. They were watching the horizon every day, trusting him, believing that the boss would come back. Shackleton knew the clock was ticking. The Antarctic winter was closing in again. The pack ice would soon surround Elephant Island, sealing it off for another year. If that happened, the men would die. He borrowed a ship, the Southern Sky. He sailed south. But the ice stopped him. 100 miles from the island, the white wall was impassable. He had to turn back. He went to Uruguay. He borrowed a trawler. The ice stopped him again. He went to Chile. He borrowed a steamer, the Yelcho. It was a small rusty tug, totally unsuited for the ice, but it was all there was. This was his 4th attempt. It was August 30th, 1916. 4 months had passed since he left the men on the beach. 4 months of wind and starvation. On Elephant Island, the situation was terminal. The food was gone. The men were boiling old seal bones. Blackborough, the stowaway, had severe frostbite in his toes. The doctors, Macklin and McElroy, had performed surgery by the light of a blubber lamp, amputating the toes to stop the gangrene. Morale was hanging by a thread. Every morning, Frank Wild, the second in command, would crawl out of the hut. He would look at the grey ocean. He would crawl back in and say, "Roll up your sleeping bags, boys. The boss may come today." He said it for 128 days, but on August 30th he didn't crawl back in. He saw smoke. A small ship was picking its way through the mist. The Yelcho. Shackleton was on the bridge, peering through his binoculars. His heart was hammering. He was counting the figures on the beach. They were tiny black dots against the snow. He counted 1, 2, 5, 10. He lowered the glasses. He turned to Worsley, his voice choking. "They are all there, Skipper," he said. "They are all there." The rescue was frantic. The Yelcho sent a boat. Shackleton didn't even step ashore. He stood in the boat, shouting, "Get in, get in!" He was throwing cigarettes to the men, pulling them aboard by their collars. He was terrified the ice would close again. Within an hour, the camp was empty. The overturned boats were left behind. The pile of seal bones was left behind. The 22 men were on board the Yelcho, laughing, crying, eating. As the ship turned north, steaming away from the nightmare, Shackleton stood at the rail. He looked back at Elephant Island. He looked further south, toward the Weddell Sea, where the Endurance lay crushed at the bottom of the dark water. He had failed. The Imperial Transantarctic expedition was a catastrophe. He had lost his ship. He had lost his fortune. He had failed to cross the continent. He had failed to even set foot on it. And yet, as he looked at the 27 men around him, gaunt, broken, but breathing, he knew he had achieved something else, something that couldn't be plotted on a map. He had beaten the arithmetic. He had cheated the hunger. But as the adrenaline faded and the warmth of the ship settled around him, the ghosts began to gather. The men were safe, yes, but the dogs were gone. The beautiful, strong animals that had pulled them, loved them, and fed them. They were part of the ice now. Shackleton lit a cigarette. His hands were shaking. The world was about to welcome him back as a hero. But he knew, deep in the quiet places of his mind, that he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had made a terrible bargain with the cold, and he had paid the bill. The ice was behind them, but the memory of the taste of dog meat and the sound of the rifle shots in the snow, that was coming home with them.